IT support.
This afternoon I'm going to talk to you about CNAPS. And this is joint work with my fellow students, Jonathan Gordon, James Requima, and my PhD supervisors, Sebastian Noesen and Rich Turner. So first, a little bit of background on multitask few-shot learning, which is what this is all about. Humans are able to learn new things and new concepts with just a few examples, and machines should be able to do the same thing. And our goal here is to quickly adapt and learn to make predictions from a small number of training examples or shots at test time. And the strategy here is we're going to leverage a large number of tasks and learn from those tasks in order to generalize to some new unseen task. In some scenarios, actually this overlaps with what Andrew was talking about, that might come in handy, is to do 3D reconstruction from a small number of views. And you probably used very geometry-based approaches, and these days you would use machine learning approaches to do something very similar. So given some views, learn the latent space that can generate these 3D models. Similarly, you might want to have a recommendation algorithm or personalize some services. And you've got lots and lots of users, but you don't have much signal from each user. Perhaps you have a few likes or a few ratings, but you still want to make good recommendations based on that data. Whoops. Now I've really broken it. There we go. There we go. Same idea is if you wanted to do face recognition within groups. Maybe you've got lots of different groups and different number of people in the groups and different number of photos of each person, but you still want to do good face recognition. So first a little bit of math, and then we'll move on to some pictures. This is all work based on a so-called conditional neural process. And a conditional neural process is really just a predictive distribution of the form here, where you want to predict some value y star, some output based on some inputs x star, and some global parameters theta, and the sort of context or the training data for the task d tau. And so just going through that, tau is the task. This d tau is the so-called context or the training data for the task. The starred x's and y's are the target or the things you want to make predictions for. Theta, the global parameters that are shared across tasks, and the psi tau are parameters learned for each specific task. So that gets all the notation out of the way. And the idea is this CNAPS system specializes conditional neural processes to multitask classification. And in particular, one main difference is that the shared parameters, the global parameters, are trained offline. So they're sort of pre-trained and learned and fixed. And what this does is it captures the high-level features of the data sets, facilitating multitask and transfer learning. The other difference is that the task-specific parameters, psi, tau, are parameters of the model itself, as opposed to some fixed-dimensional input to the model as they are in conditional neural processes. And this gives us a lot more flexibility and support for a really wide range of distribution. Okay, so now away from symbols to pictures. So this is a standard image recognition system. You put some kind of image in, like a cat, and it goes through a feature extractor, perhaps some convolutional layers or residual layers, and then there's a linear classification stage, and out you get a label cat, hopefully. Now, in multitask learning, at test time, we want a few changes. We want to support brand new tasks that have maybe a different number of classes and entirely different classes. So instead of cats and dogs and birds, maybe you're asked to recognize characters or plants or something like that. And so this implies that we have to change the linear classifier for each new task. So we have to learn a new set of weights because there may be a different number of weights, and you're going to need a different set of weights. And so the linear stage has to adapt. Similarly, we might want to recognize or interpret very diverse data, as I say, from handwritten characters to natural images. And we sort of want to be robust to very small number of training examples. So we choose also to parameterize the feature extractor and adapt it as well. So the big question of what we'll talk about going forward is how you do this quickly and economically. And a key ingredient to this of how we'll parameterize the feature extraction stage is the so-called film layer, and film is an acronym for feature-wise linear modulation. And the idea here is that a film layer scales and shifts the output of a convolutional stage feature map. So at the output of some convolutional layer might be some number of feature maps, say 64 or 128 of these maps, and for each one of those maps, there's an affine transform that weights it and shifts it. And so simple affine transformation on every map, and so if there's 64 layers, you're going to have 64 pairs of these parameters. And the idea is you add these film layers into convolutional network blocks. Here it shows a ResNet block that might be repeated many times in a many-layer ResNet, and you stick in these little adapters. And it's maybe not a great analogy, but these are almost like eyeglasses, little corrective lenses that fit in and adapt the learned set of features to some other space. And the idea is we will use these parameterizations. And as I say, very, very expressive. These sort of little adapters can make adapt from very, very, very diverse data sets. And they only add a very small number of parameters. So our entire system, these extra variables only add 1% of the number of weights. So how do we do this? Well, here's our feature extractor again. And we first pre-train it offline on something like ImageNet, a big database. And we learn the parameters, theta, and fix them. And then we add these little film layer parameters, little adapters in there. And we learn the parameters for that based on another network, a hyper network that we call the feature extractor adaptation network. And it takes in the training tasks, or the training examples for each task. And the idea is the system, this adapter network that learns how to generate the parameters, is trained on many, many tasks from many, many data sets. Similarly, we can adapt the classifier as well. So again, we take in the training examples for the class, but this time it's all class conditional. We take all the examples from each class and process them separately. So if there's 5 different classes of things, cats and dogs and other types of stuff, we take all the examples that are cats, all the examples that are dogs, and sort of split them and process them one at a time. In particular, we pool the features. We average the features from each class. And then we use another network parameterized with phi sub w, which generates the weights, and phi sub b, which generates the biases. And because we can do this quite efficiently, because it really is only one column of the weight matrix and one element of the bias matrix that will affect the logit in the softmax for that class. So we can do it bit by bit. So when the first class comes through, cats or whatever, it generates one column of weights that would affect the cat logit in the softmax. Similarly, we can generate all the weights for all the classes, and once we have all the weights for all the classes, we can pass features through and generate a proper label. So here, as I say, we've got 2 mechanisms for parameterizing the whole system with quite economically and not a lot of extra parameters. So altogether, this is how the system works. You take a training task, you pass it through this feature extractor adaptation network, you generate the film parameters. Now you can pass your input through the classifier because it's fully parameterized. Then we take the output of the feature extractor and combine it also with the training examples, and it feeds into the classification adaptation network, and then you can generate the weights and biases, and then you can classify. So that's the processing flow. And we tested this out on a very, very challenging data set. It's actually called Meta-Dataset, which is appropriate, I guess, and it's now sort of the most difficult multitask few-shot learning benchmark. It consists of 10 different data sets, 8 of them training, and 2 of them entirely held out. So at test time, you don't even see the held out data sets. And the way they've done the splits is that the training classes are all different from the test classes. So generalization is very important to be able to do well here. And the procedure for sampling each task during training is we just choose a data set at random. Then you choose a number of classes from those data sets, somewhere between 5 and 50 from the data set. And then you choose a random number of training examples or shots for each class, and obviously you need at least one example per class. And there's a maximum of 500 across all the classes. So if your random number of classes was, say, 20, and then the random number of shots in total was, say, 200, you'd have on average 10 examples per class to learn from. But it could be less, again, because the numbers are assigned randomly to class. Some of the data sets have hierarchy, and in choosing the classes, that hierarchy is respected. And it takes about 100,000 tasks to train these networks. Here is the results on this benchmark. And of course, because it's the method we put in the paper, the CNAPS right-hand column is bold and best in pretty much all the categories, and which is actually quite an accomplishment because the leading technique, this so-called proto-mammal, which is a fusion of prototypical networks and model-agnostic meta-learning, was pretty strong benchmark, but this pretty much beats it in all the categories, often quite comfortably. But not only is it more accurate in terms of classification accuracy, or better in terms of classification accuracy, it's faster. So given enough time and enough data, you could just learn all these system parameters with gradient descent. And so, if, as I say, time and data were not a problem, you could just do that. But the idea here is we want to be fast, and we want it to work with a low number of examples. And in these plots, the blue dots are CNAPS, our system, and the red dots are stochastic gradient descent. And the horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is accuracy. So you probably notice all the blue dots to the left means that's faster, that's good. And further up means higher accuracy. And so in general, our system is at least 5 times faster at test time, because instead of having to do a backward and forward pass that you need to do in gradient descent, you just need one forward pass through the network. Also, the accuracy at lower number of training examples, like lower shot, is generally higher. Like if you look at the MNIST data set there, at one shot, we're somewhere at 70 some odd %, whereas the gradient descent is somewhere 40 some odd %. And so we're sort of better in lower number of examples and certainly faster. And one of the reasons why it would be better, more accurate, is as I say, gradient descent with a few number of examples can overfit quite badly, whereas we're quite resilient to that because the network has shared parameters learned over many, many tasks. The other sort of a surprising thing that we did is we used the same system for continual learning, sometimes called lifelong learning. It involves learning a sequence of tasks over time without forgetting the earlier ones. And we used exactly the same model. We did not train this for continual learning specifically. We used exactly the same model that we used for few-shot classification. And the only tweak that we made at test time was we put in a bit of memory. We learned the feature representations going into the adaptation networks and did a running average of them between the sequential tasks. And our results here, oh, I keep hitting the wrong button here. There we go. Are also excellent. There's 2 benchmarks, so-called split MNIST, where you might know MNIST has, it's a digit recognition thing, 0 to 10, and we try and learn it in stages. So you learn 0s and 1s, and then 2s and 3s, and then 4s and 5s, etc. And you do these tasks sequentially and try not to forget. Same thing, there's a same deal with split CFAR, is that you sort of do chunks of 10 classes at a time in sequence. In all cases, we're really, really close to the best, and a lot of these are very, very strong baselines. This Romanian walker, the R-walk thing, is state-of-the-art numbers on these tasks. And we're either very, very, very close to what they do, or in the case of CFAR 100, better. And this is not being trained on continual learning, never being exposed to these data sets during training, and observing orders of magnitude fewer samples at test time. And that's it. Off to pizza.
All right. Thanks for coming. As said, AI and pizza will go into the summer break, but research will not. So please use the opportunity outside to talk to John and Andrew and all the others of us from Microsoft Research and your colleagues around. Thank you for coming and enjoy the pizza.
No, I have my bag. I think I'll just delete the file on here.
Great stuff, man.
Hey, thanks.
That's really cool.
Good to see Andy. Yeah, good.
So